Hello and welcome to the Outsider Art Podcast, episode 17, Henry Darger, part 3. Before we start, just a quick note that this episode may not be suitable for children or sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. This will be the third and final episode on Henry Darger. As I've mentioned in the previous episodes, there's an abundance of resources on Henry Darger, and it would be easy to continue on to infinity, but I do have to let him go at some stage, so I'll apply the handbrake at the end of this episode. At the end of the last episode, I just delved into one of the more controversial aspects of Darger's art, that being that many of his artworks featured naked girls, and that many of these naked girls were depicted with male genitals. This, as well as his grotesque illustrations of child torture, strangulation, and murder, had provided plenty of juicy material for serious scholars and amateur psychologists alike, and a vast range of theories have been advanced in the almost 50 years since Darger's death. Was Henry a pedophile? Did he have the mind of a serial killer? Was he just naive about the differences between genders? Or was there a codified intention to draw these girl boys that was driven from past experiences? For someone who was pretty much a closed book throughout his life, we have found that upon opening his books, Henry Darger was a deeply layered, complex person. Yet we can have no complete sense of who Henry Darger was, and that adds extra textures of fascination to an already fascinating character, and leaves a lot of open-ended questions. I think that time has aided in our view of Darger, time that has allowed a more nuanced examination of his work and the context in which it was created. Rather than the shock of the new, our more educated eyes can now accommodate the contentious imagery and incorporate it into the bigger picture. But the ongoing interest and continued study of Darger also means that new theories about his life and his motivations are also constantly arising. It's kind of inevitable, given Darger's body of work, that we will persist in trying to unwrap the enigma. Sometimes this may manifest in meticulously researched authorial projections that present a Darger that he himself may not have recognized. One of the trickiest things to achieve in a biography is to avoid the tendency to fill in the gaps with fictional additions that promote a particular theory or idea. It's especially thorny when the biography is that of an unknown person. Of course, this device does add colour and life to what could become a dry recitation of knowable facts, but it also often becomes a thread that, once pulled upon, may lead to fiction presented as fact. Darger's biographers are not alone in using this device. It's almost a trope of biography, autobiography, and history, but it is something that should perhaps come with a warning. Reader beware, the person shown may not reflect the actual person. So we do need to be careful. However, if we keep this in mind, I do think that these theories can add further illumination to ways of thinking about Darger and his work. They're not necessarily going to be right, but they are going to be interesting. So let's take a look at some of the theories that have been put forward with regards to the naked girls with male genitals that are ubiquitous throughout Darger's artistic work. In his chapter, The Fantasy Phallus, John M. MacGregor discusses a number of possibilities for Darger giving girls male genitals. He then goes on to present examples within the realms of gender fluidity, specifically girls acting as boys. He also discusses psychoanalytic theories that could be in play, and raises the issue of potential homosexual experiences, sexual abuse, and sadism that Darger may have experienced in his youth, and especially at the Lincoln Asylum. MacGregor comments, quote, "While it seems unlikely that Darger was completely unaware, at some level of consciousness, that girls differ from boys in not possessing male genitals, it seems far more possible that he had no clear understanding of what they do possess. It is easily possible that he never saw the female genitals, even in a child." End quote. Girls in the realms are never depicted with female genitalia. Sometimes there are no genitals depicted in his naked children, but often this is related to the pose, angle, or size of the illustration. In his writings, Darger studiously avoided discussing matters of sex and sexual anatomy. MacGregor writes that, quote, "It appears that he views all sexual activity as morally wrong. Even to write of sexual happenings is not permissible. It is perhaps for this reason that the realms contains almost no references to conventional sexual activities." He continues, "It is, of course, possible to question whether what we are encountering was, in fact, an aspect of Darger's reality. Given the fact that he is depicting the realms of the unreal, is it not possible that this is simply an artistic conceit, a playful but perfectly conscious manipulation of nature or anatomy? While it is not possible to know precisely what Darger believed, it seems unlikely that he would have felt comfortable playing about with sexual facts in this way. It is also significant that he never makes reference to this, to us, astonishing biological fact anywhere in his writings. The word penis, or any of the numerous popular synonyms, is never used, and this body part is accordingly never referred to. Had he intended this transformation to be a special and unique feature of the realms, he would have undoubtedly have offered some explanation for it. It is we who are left to grapple with a massive problem, which to Darger was no problem at all, but a simple fact of nature. Female children, like male children, possess a penis and testicles." End quote. Adults in the realms are never depicted naked, and as there is an almost complete absence of adult females, we cannot be sure whether he believed that females developed female genitals as they grew older. MacGregor, in his discussion of a psychoanalytic approach to Darger, comments, quote, "The survival into adulthood of a delusional belief in the existence of female children with male genitals would seem, almost invariably, to involve a curious and ambivalent mental state of knowing and not knowing." He continues, "Such a situation would seem to require reinforcement by trauma far in excess of that caused by the simple discovery of the crucial difference which distinguishes the sexes from one another. That trauma, in Darger's case, could have been supplied by the death of his mother just prior to his 4th birthday. Whatever point he had attained in his psychosexual development, there is sufficient evidence to support a prolonged regression to, and fixation at, the anal sadistic phase. This shock seems to have contributed to and maintained an unconscious awareness of an all-powerful and threatening phallic mother, now numinous because she was dead." End quote. Having dealt with the potential impact of his mother's death on Darger, MacGregor follows this with some comments on Darger's sister, whose absence had an even more profound effect on his life and work. Sorry I'm quoting so much, by the way, but it's all very interesting, this stuff. So, quote, "It was also at this point in his life that the concept of the female with male genitals became intimately linked with his sister. While all memory of his mother was repressed in later life, the obsessional involvement with this sister, who he had never seen, was established at this point in his childhood and persisted until his death. Inevitably, his conception of the missing little girl assumed many characteristics derived from his early experience of his mother, including the presence of a penis. A pathological identification with this essentially imaginary sister and the resultant confusion of gender is evident throughout the realms, in relation to all the girl heroines in the work. Since all little girls possess the male organ, it allows for the possibility of Darger's becoming his sister, merging with her, or bringing her magically back to life, a process we've actually observed in the case of his identification with the murdered girl, Annie Arenberg. In a very real sense, all of the little girls in the realms are the embodiment of one little girl." End quote. Okay, so it's all got kind of heavy, but it does reflect what we have seen in previous episodes of the podcast. Trauma is a significant player in Darger's life, and like the other artists that we have discussed, it has found an outlet and has manifested itself in his writings and artistic output in rare and unusual ways. A more radical approach to Darger's little girls is offered in Jim Elledge's book Henry Darger, Throwaway Boy. Elledge, an academic and writer, approaches Darger from the perspective of queer theory and presents his careful research in a reimagining of Darger's life as a gay man who not only had homosexual relationships but also suffered sexual abuse and trauma during his youth. From this perspective, Darger's girls are not in fact girls at all, but psychic hermaphrodites. Quote, "When Henry uses the phrase Vivian girls, it's not girls that he's actually thinking about, but Vivian Bells, fairies, pansies, queers, or queens. In fact, in Henry's second novel, which also stars the Vivians, the characters who come in contact with them refer to them as fairies more often than not. This allows Henry to give them an otherworldly cast as well as anchor them in a queer context. Such ambiguity has been a mainstream of gay art and literature for centuries, and Henry tapped into that strategy and made it his own. When he depicted the Vivian girls, Henry was actually creating an image of homosexual boys running from adult men, leading troops against enemy battalions, and undertaking spy missions against the Glandolinians. If we're to understand Henry's vision as a novelist and as artist clearly and completely, we can't ever think girls when he writes or depicts the Vivian girls. Instead, we have to substitute girl boys, gay boys, or imitation little girls, which was Henry's term for girls. They are actually the Vivian girl boys. Henry revealed who Angeline, Violet, Joy, Jenny, Catherine, Hetty, and Daisy are in his novel, but he disclosed what they are in his illustrations for it." End quote. Now, I can't say that I bought into all of Elledge's theories or conclusions about Darger, but the book is a fascinating perspective with some really intriguing historical details about the hidden lives of early 20th century Chicagoans. So we are left with many possibilities about what motivated Henry Darger to add male genitals to his naked girls, and I'm not sure we will ever likely know. Darger left us a riddle which confuses and confounds. But if he was to see the debate and controversy that has occurred for the past several decades, I suspect he may wonder what all the fuss is about. At the end of MacGregor's book, there is an appendix that is titled On the Problem of Diagnosis, in which he carefully processes potential diagnoses of Darger. He prefaces this appendix with the statement that, quote, the decision to confine discussion of what is fundamentally a clinical problem to an appendix separate from the book is based on a desire to circumvent, or at least postpone, the danger of Darger's being perceived as a case study, his work dismissed as merely symptomatic of a particular psychiatric or neurological condition. End quote. I find this approach commendable and something that is particularly apt when it comes to looking at the work of artists from outside the mainstream art world. So often their work is presented prefaced by the artist's biography rather than the other way round. I firmly believe it's the work that matters, and that the biography and diagnosis is there to aid in appreciation and understanding of the work. Like any work of art, the work of the outsider artist, in inverted commas, should be able to stand alone from the artist. MacGregor presents a vast array of diagnoses that he has considered or that were shared with him during the decade in which he was working on the book. Some of these, he mentions, have been offered with limited understanding of Darger's behaviour and life experiences. They include Tourette syndrome, multiple personality disorder, temporal lobe epilepsy, schizophrenia, and what MacGregor calls, quote, an encapsulated psychosis. MacGregor, however, concludes that, quote, the apparent continuity of Darger's mental state throughout his life, its consistent development from childhood into adulthood, has led me finally to consider a rather different diagnosis, one having its origin in Darger's fundamental symptom, autism. He continues, Darger's unusual symptoms in childhood and later as an adult conform quite exactly to the less severe form of autism first described in Europe in the 1940s and now known as Asperger's syndrome. He continues, it is significantly a diagnosis which accounts not only for his disabilities but also, and dramatically, for a number of his astonishing talents and abilities. End quote. Having myself worked and lived with people with Asperger's, this diagnosis seems to me to not only make sense, but also to help explain and round out Henry Darger and his life and work. Autistic writer Cameron Strawn writes about Henry Darger and autism on his website, and reflects on the similarities between his and Darger's lived experiences. I'll put a link to the article on the podcast website. Of particular interest was his comment about obsessive collecting and the tendency to fixate on losing items from his collection. Darger's loss of a newspaper photo of Elsie Parubak, whose well-publicized kidnapping and murder in Chicago in 1911, was essentially the inception point of the realms of the unreal. Henry Darger is arguably the most well-known and influential of outsider artists. His work is held in the permanent collections of many significant museums, both mainstream and those specializing in outsider and art brut, including the American Folk Art Museum, which holds many of Darger's archives in the Henry Darger Study Center, Intuit in Chicago, which has the Henry Darger Room Collection, and the Collection de l'Art Brut, amongst many others. MoMA, the Smithsonian, and the Chicago Museum of Contemporary Art also hold his work. Darger has featured in a substantial number of exhibitions as well, alongside both past and contemporary artists, including Francisco Goya and Grayson Perry. But I think it is his influence on contemporary artists where Darger has really had an impact on popular culture, both high and low. It is not without some degree of delightful irony that we find that someone, for which the popular culture of his times were both the source of his artistic output and much of his inspiration, has now become iconized in modern culture. Darger has influenced, amongst others, artists, musicians, filmmakers, playwrights, novelists, poets, and even game developers, who have taken his work as a jumping-off point for their own craft. He has become almost deified within popular culture. You can even follow Instagram artists for whom Darger is a major influence. Kyoko Art, for example, is a Japanese artist who creates wonderfully faithful homages to Darger. And Philippe Cohen Solal, co-founder of Gotan Project, has not only produced an album with Mike Lindsay featuring lyrics by Henry Darger, but has also made a fantastic 7-part podcast series about Darger called Outsider, The Amazing Story of Henry Darger, which includes interviews with Kyoko Lerner, Michael Bonesteel, Jim Elledge, Deborah Kerr, Grayson Perry, and Darger documentary maker Mark Stokes. It's recommended listening, and I'll put a link up in the show notes on the podcast website. As I seem to have repeated ad nauseum throughout this series, there is a huge wealth of material on Darger to explore, and I really have only just scratched the surface. It seems to me that Henry Darger can very quickly become an obsession and an inspiration that takes people on long journeys of discovery and creation. I would encourage you all to dig deeper with Henry Darger. It's undoubtedly a rabbit hole of immense proportions. But given that immense proportions was something Darger never seemed to shy away from, it's hardly surprising. I'd like to finish up this episode and series with a quote from the former director of the Contemporary Centre at the American Folk Art Museum, Brooke Davis Anderson, who escorted Darger's work to the Mixed Up Childhood exhibition that I mentioned in the last episode. She is quoted from an article in the New Zealand Herald at the time. Quote, "I actually just find the paintings extraordinarily beautiful. I think they can live for me that simply." End quote. Righto. That's where we'll leave this series on Henry Darger. I hope you've all been enthused to check out his work further. I'll post the links I've mentioned and a reading list that will be by no means comprehensive on the podcast website, acast.shows.com/outsider-art-podcast. I'd also like to encourage you to get in touch if you've got any questions or thoughts on an episode, or if you just want to chat. I've had some fun conversations over the last couple of weeks with Scott and Amy, so thanks to them for their feedback and support. I'd still like to get some discussion going on the podcast Facebook page, but since it's still severely undersubscribed, you can also contact me via Instagram or now via email at outsiderartpodcast@gmail.com, and that's all one word. I'll put the links on the podcast website. And I'd be eternally grateful if you could rate the show on whatever podcatcher you listen to. 5 stars would be appreciated, but I'd settle for 4 as it leaves room for the improvement that I know the podcast needs. A review would also be awesome. Please follow and do share the show with those who might find it interesting and informative. And look out for the next episode on, well, I'm not sure who yet, but I'm hoping to present my first episode on a contemporary living artist. So stand by. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the Outsider Art Podcast.